So my wife's a second grade teacher, and she asked me to build her a stool that she could sit on while she reads to her class. And of course, the answer was yes. But the problem was, she didn't really give me much to go by. Do you want it modern or traditional, 3 legs or 4? What type of wood do you want it made out of? I don't know, dark wood. Okay, so you want walnut. We'll use walnut. Do you have any other requests or anything? I don't know, I trust you. Just build something and I'll let you know if I like it. Okay, so you want to make a sample. Stool sample. Okay. I just hope it doesn't stink. So, I started by resawing this 2-inch thick piece of walnut slab over the bandsaw. And this is actually the first time I used the full resaw capacity for this saw. And I gotta say, this thing performed flawlessly. That part that looked like I was getting stuck in the beginning was me just kind of catching the wood on the throat plate. The saw wasn't having any trouble cutting or anything. And this is just the stock blade that came with the bandsaw, which is funny because I usually switch out the stock blades like on the table saw or miter saw. But this one cut really smooth, so I'll probably just keep this one in. I don't plan on changing it out anytime soon. And speaking of smooth, let me actually bring it in a little bit closer to see what I'm talking about. I mean, it's not like glass or anything. It still is a bandsaw after all. But I won't even have to remove that much material when I send it through the planer, which I'll have to do a little bit later, because the only way I can fit it through now is to send it through cross grain, which will probably result in a little bit of tear out. So we'll let that rest for a minute and we'll move on to the legs. I actually already had some wood milled up from a previous project that I could have used for the legs, but then I decided to make the stool a little bit taller so that wood would no longer work, so I have to mill up some more. And I don't particularly like ripping rough cut lumber at the table saw, but this is straight enough that I felt okay about it. And because it's decently straight and flat, it's not going to take that many passes over the joiner to get a flat face. And I'm only doing the face because I'm going to use templates for these legs, so I don't need to joint the edges. And I put it down on the cast iron to check for flatness, and it looks good. And I'm back over to the table saw to rip this down to a little bit over its final thickness. I could have done this over at the bandsaw, which would have been a little bit less sketchy. But since I didn't do that, I also could have put in my ripping blade, which would have made the resaw go a little bit faster. So it may seem like I chose the slightly sketchier and slightly slower option to resaw these boards. And to that I say, nothing, I guess, because that's exactly what I did. So like I said, I resaw them down to close to their final thickness. And that's just because I knew I was going to bring them over to the planer just so I can remove those saw marks. At which point they're at their final thickness and we'll just let them hang out for a minute. And while those leg blanks rest, let's take a minute to talk about design. Now I'm no master furniture designer, if that's even a thing, but I do think some of the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to upping the design quotient on a project would be to add curves. And the easiest way by far to do that would be to use a template. And templates don't have to be that intimidating. You don't have to use a CNC or a laser. You can just sketch it out by hand, like I'm doing here. And my 2 main considerations when I'm making a template are 1, is it structurally sound? And 2, do I like the way it looks? That's it. And I'm going to use a number of different tools to cut out the template, but that's just because I have them. You really could just cut the whole thing out with a jigsaw and then sand down to the line. Also, I'll have plans available if you want to build this stool yourself. And with those plans will come a PDF of the template so you can cut it out yourself, and the data file if you want to use the CNC. And to the extent that you care about what other people think about your builds, they tend to be super impressed when you incorporate curves into a piece. They tend to think it's so fancy, and I really do see why. But in all actuality, you're really just tracing. So something that they think is fancy really isn't. It's kind of like when I thought a Canadian tuxedo was fancy until I found out what it was. And I was like, that's not fancy at all. All right, now that I have my fancy template made, I can take it over to my leg blank and trace it out. And I'm using one of these white pencils because it's easier to see on this dark walnut. And if you don't have one of those, just steal one of your kids' crayons. That's what I did before I got these colored carpenter pencils. Now I don't know if you saw my dining room table build video. I'll put a link in the description if you didn't. But I had to use a jigsaw to cut out those legs because my bandsaw died mid-build. But here I'm able to use a bandsaw and I'm able to get much closer to the line. And if you're wondering what those relief cuts I'm making at the curved area of the leg are for, most of the time I'm too lazy to change my bandsaw blade, and the one I have on there now is too wide to navigate that tight curve. So that just makes it a little bit easier to cut that tight radius. Now I'm going to attach the template to the leg I just cut out. Then I'm going to take it over to the router table to flush trim it. And I'm going to route every side except for the side that's going to attach to the stretcher. I really want that to be a seamless joint, so I'm going to do that at the table saw. And the problem that raises is that I can't go all the way around the piece with one continuous motion at the router table, which means that I would either have to begin routing at the curved part or do a climb cut at the curved part, both of which situations are no-goes. Because that curved part has a decent amount of material to remove and it's in grain, I would just be asking for kickback. But it's all good. I could just flip the leg and the template over, raise the router bit up, and then route going the other direction. And the only thing about that is that this router bit is pretty massive, and raising it up that high leaves more of the router bit exposed than I'd like. But with these grout float / push blocks, I think I should be okay. So about what I said earlier about wanting my template to look good and be structurally sound. What I'm doing here is more for the structurally sound part. I want to make sure the joint where the leg meets the stretcher is a solid, seamless joint. And to be fair, it might have been okay if I just flush trimmed around the whole template, but by doing it this way at the table saw, I know it's going to be as good as I can make it. And to do that, I'm using this microjig clamp and hardware system. And I think microjig makes some pretty good stuff. Now, some of their items can be a little bit pricey for my taste, but everything I bought from them has worked great. And I really love this match fit system. It's super versatile. I'll leave links in the description if you want to check it out, but this is probably my favorite thing I've ever bought from them. And as you saw there, I was just using the template as a reference for making the cut, which I then made on each of the 4 legs. And after making those cuts, what you're left with are 4 identical walnut stool legs. Ooh, fancy. And from the legs, we're going to turn our attention back to the stool top, or seat if you prefer. For the top, we're going to make it a 12-inch diameter circle. And I was going to cut the circle directly out of the walnut slab, but I decided to make a template. And the reason for that is in case I wanted to make another stool or something else that required a 12-inch diameter circle, I'd have the template on hand. Plus, I had the extra MDF. And to cut it out, I'm using this pretty cool router jig that Tamar from 3x3 Customs designed. I believe it's called the 6-in-1 router jig because it really does have a lot of functions, but to be honest, in my shop, it gets most of its work cutting circles. And the reason I like this one for cutting circles so much is because, I don't know, you guys let me know if I'm wrong, but I don't know if there's any other circle cutting jig where you don't have to put a hole in your workpiece. Not that having a hole in this template would really make a difference, but I just like that I don't have to if I don't want to. As I cut it out with the jigsaw, I err on leaving more material rather than less, because I'm going to take it over to the router table to clean it up. And like I said earlier, the jigsaw is not as accurate as the bandsaw, and I don't want to cut into the circle, so I just leave a little bit extra, just as a precaution. You know, I've heard it said that the mark of a good artist is the ability to draw a perfect circle freehand. Actually, I'm lying. I never heard that. I just made that up. Plus, I didn't even draw this circle, and it certainly wasn't freehand. But it is perfect. So now I take my perfect circle and try to transfer that perfection over to my walnut slab. And I purposely place my template over to the side just so I can capture that transition between the sapwood and the hardwood. And here we are again, cutting out another 1-foot circle with the jigsaw. Except for cutting through walnut is a lot slower than cutting through MDF. And if I remember correctly, I tried this on the bandsaw, but like I said, the blade on there is pretty wide and it just wasn't able to go around the circle as tightly as I would like. But it's all good, because while using the jigsaw is definitely not as fast as using the bandsaw, it's definitely faster than changing out the bandsaw blade. And we're about to head back over to the router to do some more template routing, and I'm attaching this template with blue tape and CA glue. And alternatively, I could have used some double-sided tape, but I didn't have any at the time. and the routing went great. It's kind of funny though. There was a section there where the wood shavings went from dark to light, and for a brief moment I was like, oh no, am I cutting through the template? But I realized pretty quickly that that was just the sapwood. But there was definitely a brief millisecond of panic. So remember when I originally resawed the slab, I never cleaned off the bandsaw marks. But now that the circle's cut out, I can finally send it through the planer with the grain without having to worry about tear out. So a little trick to use in case you ever need to draw a line down the center of a circle. First, put the point of a square anywhere on the edge of the circle. Then mark the two spots where the X and Y axis intersect the circle. Then connect those 2 points, and that draws a line right down the middle of the circle. And as a bonus tip, if you do that again anywhere else on the circle, wherever those two lines intersect will be the center of that circle. And to be fair, that little trick is less of a trick and more of just math, I think. But whatever you want to call it, it gets you a line right down the middle of a circle, which is what I needed here. Because I need it to size my stretcher piece that I'm going to use to connect to the legs. And I use it to mark somewhat crudely here because I plan to leave it a little bit long and then nibble down until I get to the perfect length. And I could have made this cut at the table saw with a crosscut sled, but I'm choosing to use the miter saw. The miter saw is just faster, and I don't have any problems with accuracy with mine. But one thing you'll note is I'm using that hold down stick with mine because the piece I'm cutting is so small. In my opinion, the miter saw is one of the safer saws in the shop, but you never want to have your hand that close to a spinning blade. And speaking of saw blades, I was planning on using the dado blade to cut the half flap for these two stretchers. But my dado throat plate wasn't acting right, so I had to call an audible and use the router. But to do that, I had to first build this jig. And this is actually my first time building this jig and using this method, but I actually really liked it. What I like is that you literally build the jig around the work pieces to use as references. So, as long as you get everything set up squarely, it's going to be really hard to mess up. You saw me use the first stretcher piece to set the width of the jig, and the second stretcher piece to set the width of the half lap. And even though I have two half laps to cut, since both of my stretcher pieces are the same size, I'll be able to use this same jig for both stretcher pieces. But I suppose it's not perfect. I suppose one downside to using this method over the table saw method is that you actually have to build a jig. But as you can see, it doesn't take that long, and this would be great for larger pieces that would be more cumbersome to take over to the table saw. So I want to make sure that this is centered within the jig, so I already made marks earlier with a marking knife. And after I get it in place, I clamp it down so that it doesn't move. Then I drill a couple of pilot holes so that I could hold the workpiece in place with a couple of screws. And obviously I offset the pilot holes just a little bit because I do not want the two screws running into each other. And once I'm done cutting the half lap, I'll remove the two screws, and having those two screw holes in there doesn't really matter because once it's assembled, you'll never see them. I make my initial passes with a router and a templating bit, referencing the jig as I clear out the half lap. I'll then take it out of the jig and use the channel that I just cut as reference when I go down to the final depth. And to find that final depth, I'm going to use this guy, another microjig product. This basically just uses your workpiece as a reference, then automatically finds the halfway point for you to set your saw blade or your router bit. And to not leave you in suspense, this thing works great. But this is one of those microjig products that I was talking about earlier that just seems like it costs more than it should. I mean, it's like $30 or $35, and basically it's just plastic and stickers. Then again, maybe I'm just an old man who's just ranting about how much cheaper everything used to be back in my day. I mean, I did buy it, and it does work, so what am I even complaining about? I mean, I still think it should be cheaper, though. But anyway, a couple of takeaways. I did really like this method, like I said, but I did get a pretty good amount of tear out. But I think that could be eliminated by just taking smaller passes. Honestly, I knew I was taking too big of passes, but anyway. Another thing you want to do is to make sure you sand before you do this, or if you're going to sand afterwards, just make sure you don't sand in the section where the half lap is, because that'll just result in a loose fitting joint. But all in all, this thing fits perfectly. I have no complaints. Okay, so I'm going to use the domino to join these together, but if I didn't have that, I would just use dowels. And for those of you that don't know this about the domino, when you use it, you always want to have the dust collection on. And for the first couple of mortises that I plunged, Of course, I forgot to have the dust collection on. Now, it didn't ruin my project or anything, but I'll show you a little bit later where that came into play. Now, I don't know if you noticed earlier when I was sizing the stretcher, but I have these legs positioned all the way out to the edge of the top. And since the stool's not going to have any kind of overhang, I want to make sure I have some visual separation between the legs and the top. And you really could do this a ton of different ways. You could use a jigsaw, bandsaw, or a sander even, but I'm going to use the router, which is kind of an emerging theme on this project. I've been doing a lot of routering. That doesn't sound right. I've been doing a lot of routing. Anyway, here I just made a mark 3/4 of an inch from the edge of the leg, and I just set my fence back 1/4 of an inch from the front of the router bit. And I'm going pretty slow here because this part of the stool leg that I'm routing is in grain. And the slow speed resulted in a little bit of burning, but I can clean that up with the sander. Alternatively, if you were going to do this and you knew what size you wanted your reveal to be, you could just cut that reveal out on the template itself and make all 4 of them identical. But this is the way I chose to do it. And as you see me doing the glue up here, it should have been a pretty straightforward glue up, and for the most part it was. Although connecting the stretcher with the leg was a little bit awkward, mainly because of the splay of the leg. Also, I didn't want to bang too hard with the mallet and end up denting the workpiece. So I just ended up using brute force and kind of using my body weight to push them together. So I guess there was some benefit to eating all those extra donuts. So as I put these in the clamps, you'll see I have a couple of clamping blocks on there. Those are made from pine and they're cut out on the miter saw at a 3-degree angle. The 3-degree angle just matches the display of the legs, and they're attached with CA glue. The reason I'm able to do this is because it's pine. If you try to attach a hardwood with CA glue, you'll have a much harder time getting them off. And if you saw me ratcheting down the clamps really tightly, it shouldn't have been that hard. I think that's the result of me forgetting to turn the dust collection on the domino. There was likely some sawdust in the mortise that made it hard for the 2 pieces to join together. I guess I got kind of lucky that the piece didn't blow out and it still came together, but it should have been a lot easier. And if that was a small win, then this was a small loss. Despite me checking and double checking the position of my router bit, it must have slipped or something when I started routing because it was much lower than I wanted it to be. And instead of having a smooth, rounded over edge, I had this little ledge on there. It was really frustrating. I don't know if it was user error or tool error, but it's nothing we can't fix with a little bit of angry hand sanding. I readjusted the bit and continued putting a 1/8 inch roundover on the base. Although I didn't do the outside of the legs because that's going to get a different treatment, and I didn't do the part where the half flap's going to be because I'll do that later. So like I said, the outside of the leg gets a different treatment. It's going to still be a roundover, but just a much bigger roundover. So with that, I'm going to do that in 2 separate passes. After the first pass, I just raise the bit and send it through again. And the second pass completely rounds over the outside edge of the leg. After that, it should be pretty good, but I always like to touch it up with a little bit of hand sanding. This glue up was pretty straightforward. It was just joining the 2 half flaps together and putting an F-clamp on there. The wetness you see there is just from a little bit of water I used to try to clean up the glue squeeze out. For the finish, I'm using 2 coats of Rubio Monocoat. If you want some more detail about my finish process, just check out my dining room table video that I referenced earlier. One thing about Rubio is that it does go a long way, but it's still not cheap, so you definitely don't want to mix too much. And for this stool, the amount I mixed, which actually turned out to be the perfect amount, was 1 tablespoon of Rubio and 1 teaspoon of hardener, and I did that for each coat. And to attach the stool top, I'm using figure 8 fasteners. I did drill pilot holes and screw in the screws loosely at first. Then I went back and tightened them all up while making sure that everything was centered. And I did break the edge of the bottom of the feet with a sanding block, but my wife still wanted felt pads, so we went ahead and stuck those on. And with that, I was ready to submit my stool sample. And my wife really did love it. She thought it turned out great, and so did her kids. As a matter of fact, one of them even wanted me to build him one just like it. And of course, the answer was no.